did Menno Henselmans just myth-bust lengthened partials and stretch-mediated hypertrophy? Welcome back. Dr. Milo, PhD in sports science here, reacting to Menno Henselmans' takes. First up, we're reviewing his advice on full range of motion, as that is my area of expertise. So I want to see whether or not his advice is correct. Let's get into it.
Two recent studies found that training with a partial range of motion is better for muscle hypertrophy than training with a full range of motion. Is training with a full range of motion still the way to go? I recently recorded a lecture for my PT course, and I would like to give you a free excerpt of that where I explain exactly what the current deal is with full range of motion training, stretch-mediated hypertrophy and lengthened partials. I hope you enjoy it. Principle number 3 is that you generally want to train with full range of motion, and that's because of stretch-mediated hypertrophy. You specifically want to train with full range of motion when it increases the lengthening of the muscles.
All right, before we go any further, I would just like to clarify that lengthened partials or full range of motion probably don't induce stretch-mediated hypertrophy. It's a misnomer, essentially. People in the fitness industry have started calling it stretch-mediated hypertrophy, when in reality, that is likely not what's happening. Stretch-mediated hypertrophy originates as a term from animal data starting in the 70s, looking at the impact of long-duration, high-intensity stretching interventions in animals, often causing increases in muscle mass of like 1 to 300%. Now, that research has then been kind of generalized to humans, where in humans performing stretching interventions of like an hour a day, we do see hypertrophy, especially with longer durations of stretching, like generally higher intensities and higher durations of stretching of over an hour and a half of stretching per week at higher intensities. That's where we start seeing some muscle growth in humans. However, we only start observing that stretch-mediated hypertrophy in humans with relatively higher doses and generally with higher intensities. When you're doing lengthened partials or full range of motion training, you might be spending an additional 1 to 2 minutes in the lengthened position per workout. If we need to be stretching for over an hour and a half a week at maximum muscle lengths to start seeing appreciable hypertrophy, it doesn't stand to reason that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is what is occurring in the context of lengthened partials or full range of motion, where we're not even necessarily training at the longest possible muscle lengths, let alone for an hour and a half a week or more. So all in all, it's just overwhelmingly unlikely that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is a play. I'll have an article linked down below and or video linked down below on the topic where I go in depth. But common mistake, I think, is to call it stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And that's why I've tried to avoid that in basically all of my content.
Many people think of the range of motion as the distance the bar travels. That is not true. The range of motion is measured in the degrees of hip flexion for the hip, and you can measure the range of motion for other joints as well. So it's joint specific, how much the joint flexes or changes in angle, that is the degree of range of motion. So for a biceps curl here, it's not about how high up the weight goes, it's about the degree of elbow flexion. So here you can see in the image exactly what is range of motion. You can also see a study where they did partial range of motion and they compared that to full range of motion, and then they found a strong trend for greater muscle growth and strength development with full range of motion training.
So that's totally fine. It's not as though everyone agrees on how range of motion is defined, and it's very much task specific. Like for example, if you're calculating volume load, right? You're calculating how much weight times how many reps times how many sets were being performed, and you want to get an estimate of energy expenditure, you would need to incorporate distance traveled by the weight as well into that equation. And in that case, the distance is seen as range of motion because it literally is how much motion was being gone through, what is the range of the motion, right? So how people define range of motion is context specific. But I do think, as it says here, that for hypertrophy specifically, defining range of motion in terms of angular motion is a lot more amenable to our purposes. So yeah, I agree by and large. Just wanted to make that distinction because this is one of my pet areas.
Namely the length-tension relation, passive tension, and stretch-mediated hypertrophy. So the length-tension relationship of muscle is that muscles can generate a different amount of tension at different lengths. There's a relationship between the muscle's length and how much tension it can produce. Usually, the muscles are strongest in an anatomical position, which means when you're standing upright, just straight up like this, in that position, most muscles are strongest. When you shorten them or lengthen them from that position, they become weaker. You can see that in the left image here. It's because of the sliding filaments, the actin-myosin filaments. They basically slide into each other, sliding filament theory, as you learned of how muscles contract. When they do this, they have to be a certain length of each other. When the muscle is super short, the actin myosin filaments are kind of bunched up too much. In some muscles can even reach passive or active insufficiency, which means they are so bunched up, they are so short that they cannot effectively form cross bridges anymore. Similarly, you can have passive insufficiency when the muscle is so lengthened that they cannot reach each other anymore. So you can't form cross bridges because the actin myosin filaments, they cannot slide over each other. They can barely reach. You get this optimal overlap when the muscle is near anatomical position for most muscles. In the functional anatomy module, you can see exactly what level is optimal for every muscle and what their exact length tension relationship is, etc. Now, that's active mechanical tension. There's also a thing called passive tension. Passive tension is mostly like an elastic band that is stretched out. It is the more you stretch out a muscle, the more passive tension there is, just like an elastic band. Muscles are not elastic, they are viscoelastic, which means that if you do the stretch very slowly or you maintain a stretch position, the tension dissipates. But that's not really relevant to the point here. The passive tension in general, which also you can feel intuitively, the more stretched out a body part, the tendon, the muscle, everything are, the more passive tension there is on the muscle. Which means that if you look at the image on the right here, you can see that while the active force production is in the normal operating range, which is around anatomical position or resting length, it's optimal. If you shorten the muscle, you will get a dramatic decrease in active force production as well as in passive force production, so you become a lot weaker. But if you lengthen, you can actually get a little bit stronger. And some people, this depends on the muscle and the exact situation, but you can become a little bit stronger with some stretching or even with a lot of stretching because you get helped by passive forces, passive tension. Because the muscle is, like when it's being stretched out, it's basically passively helping, trying to get back to its shorter position. So that's passive force. Passive force is greater when you stretch the muscle more. And it's the sum of the active and the passive force together that determine, most likely, how much total tension there is and how much the muscle will grow and adapt. This passive force seems to be responsible, at least in part, for a phenomenon called stretch-mediated hypertrophy. We see in research that stretching a muscle alone, not into a form of yoga or anything like that, but in terms of heavy, weighted, long, very arduous, hardcore, painful static stretching.
Okay, I have not watched the whole video yet, so maybe he's going to correct me here. But I feel as though he's reducing mechanisms to passive tension, which at this point we just can't claim. Like, muscle physiology is very complicated. There are many things that could be at play here, besides passive tension. There's many findings that are difficult to explain if we reduce it simply to passive tension. For instance, in many of these studies, the amount of passive tension being generated at the joint angles being trained through by the full range of motion group versus the partial range of motion group, or the lengthened partial group versus the full range of motion group, the degree of additional passive tension probably isn't sufficient to really explain differences in hypertrophy, right? So I suspect he might be making the conflation here again of lengthened training causes stretch-mediated hypertrophy, because it stretches out your muscles more. When in reality, we just don't have the evidence right now to be able to make that claim with any confidence. And there's a lot of holes in that logic right now.
There have been studies, for example, that found that stretching the calves for an hour every day with an orthosis, a device that basically pulls the calves into as much stretch as possible, which is very painful. You have to do that for an hour a day. Then the calves can actually grow as much, at least in trained individuals, but also even in some trained individuals in research, they can grow as much as from doing 15 sets of calf raises per week. So it's equivalent to a serious strength training program. Of course, it's not very practical, but it illustrates that purely passive tension, no active force contribution required, can already stimulate a lot of muscle hypertrophy, and that's stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Similarly, we see that at longer lengths, muscles grow more. When they are trained at longer lengths versus shorter lengths, there are multiple studies now showing that muscles grow more, which we call stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And this is likely in large part mediated by passive mechanical tension.
All right, there's a few issues with this. First, the study by Warnicki and colleagues is referring to where they compared 1 hour of static stretching per day with a calf orthosis to lifting in the calves a few times a week, around 15 sets, I think he's recalling correctly here, 3 sessions, 5 sets each. They did observe similar hypertrophy between those two interventions. One limitation is that in this case, they were spending a total of 7 hours stretching per week, versus in total, spending maybe around 30, 40 minutes of calf training per week. So the duration of time exposed is very different. So if they needed to stretch for 7 hours a week to observe the same hypertrophy as from 15 sets of calf training a week, do we really think that in the context of lengthened partials and full range of motion training, maybe benefiting from the stretch position, that those additional 30 seconds are sufficient to induce stretch-mediated hypertrophy and result in detectably larger muscle growth? I don't think so. I really don't think so. The issue here, I think, and this is not just about Menno at all, it's about the broader fitness industry, is that stretch-mediated hypertrophy has become a pretty nebulous term, and people have lost sight of where it actually originated from, and what sort of phenomenon it is, and under what sort of circumstances it tends to occur. These circumstances are not the ones that we would observe within lengthened training. Let's continue.
And tighten is also a mechanosensor, so it also registers the amount of mechanical tension and signals to the muscle to stimulate muscle proteins and to grow and to get bigger. So in the end, we don't care about the range of motion itself, but we care about the functional excursion, which is the muscle lengthening. Functional excursion refers to the total amount of lengthening that can take place, and it's like the percentage of functional excursion that is really relevant for muscle hypertrophy. The range of motion itself, again, it's not the distance, it's not the degrees of joint angle, but it's technically the amount of muscle lengthening that takes place, and that governs primarily how much muscle you gain due to stretch-mediated hypertrophy. This also explains why seated leg curls result in significantly more muscle growth than lying leg curls. Even though both are a leg curl, the machine is roughly equivalent. During a seated leg curl, you are stretching the hamstrings at the hip because the hamstrings are biarticulate. Remember, they are not just active at the knee, but also at the hip. So when you're stretching them at the hip, they are at longer lengths. And then when you do a leg curl, they grow more because on average, you are at far longer lengths. You also reach a length closer to their maximum. In fact, in a seated leg curl machine, what you can do is you can kind of lean forward to really emphasize the stretch, especially if you don't get full range of motion when you just sit in it. Some machines, they don't let your legs go all the way up. The plates will cling onto each other, right? And you cannot get your legs fully straight. What you can do then is you can lean forward to lengthen the hamstrings even further, and therefore still allow you to get full range of motion, still get high tension in the fully stretched position. And it will probably enhance stretch-mediated hypertrophy. It's currently not clear yet how much we really need to emphasize the stretch. If it's necessary to go like all in, it probably isn't, as we'll go into in a minute. But it does seem beneficial to get high muscle lengths, especially for muscles like the hamstrings, probably that can reach very long lengths compared to their resting length.
At this point, I'll make the prediction that he'll cite the Kubo study as a means to say that we don't need to chase the longest possible muscle lengths. I'm arguing against a point that hasn't even been made here, but importantly, there is evidence to the contrary. For example, a study by Cassiano and colleagues where they compared doing bottom half partials in the calf raise with the knees extended, which would maximally lengthen the gastrocnemius, to doing a full range of motion, to doing shortened partials. In this study, they found twice as much hypertrophy at both sides measured of the gastroc when training at the longest possible muscle length compared to doing a full range of motion at very long muscle lengths. So there is evidence to the contrary, is what I'm trying to say here. But once again, from what I'm gathering here, it seems like he's conflating stretch-mediated hypertrophy as, for sure, what is happening with lengthened training. And it's intuitive, but it's likely wrong.
The extra muscle growth that occurred during the seated leg curls was specifically in the heads that are biarticulate and that stretch more at the hip. So it didn't occur in the short head of the biceps femoris because that head is not stretched at the hip, and therefore it doesn't experience stretch-mediated hypertrophy. We also have a study from the same research team which found that overhead tricep extensions stimulate significantly more growth than pushdowns. Because the long head is biarticulate, they stretch the long head, and I've long been a fan of overhead tricep extensions for this purpose. They are much more effective for the long head. Interestingly, in this study, they were also more effective for the other heads. That might be because in the case of a pushdown, in this stretched position, there is very little tension. So yes, you are getting full range of motion, but you're not getting a lot of tension in the lengthened position. For one, the long head isn't lengthened much at all. And even the other heads, they don't have a lot of tension when they are lengthened. In the case of overhead tricep extension, in this position, there is very high tension because if you use a dumbbell, this is basically the position of maximum tension, right? And if a cable, you still get high tension throughout the entire range of motion. With a pushdown, the fully lengthened position, which is the top here, if the cable is in line with the forearm, there's actually no tension at all in that position. And even when you're leaning a bit more forward, which is generally good to do during a pushdown, you want to lean forward, get the elbows forward, it's still not great. The sticking point is very clearly in full contraction. You want the sticking point to be more in the middle or near the stretch, which is true for most exercises, because you want to stimulate stretch-mediated hypertrophy. For some exercises, it actually appears that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is so much more important than full range of motion per se, that doing short range partials is more effective than training with full range of motion. This has only been found in untrained individuals so far, and that's because some exercises are just very poor at stimulating the muscle in lengthened position. This goes for leg extensions and calf raises, for example. And for those exercises, it might actually be better not to do full range of motion. What I like to do often with clients is to do the first set or full sets except the last one with full range of motion, because it allows you to track your progression. We'll go into that all in more detail later, but you want progressive overload. You need to be able to track your progression. If you don't know if you're progressing or not, you don't know if your program's working, therefore you don't know if you need to adapt it and how to adapt it. Monitoring your progression is crucial to be able to effectively update your program in response to your progression. So, and that's a big problem with training lengthened partials, like half a leg extension. What is half? You know, it's very hard to measure your performance that way.
Right, so there's a lot here. First, he recommends tracking performance as a means to assess whether or not your program is effective. In the long term, I think there's some value there. I think in the long term, if you're increasing your strength on especially single joint movements, but also multi-joint movements, there is a very high likelihood that you've grown muscle, because there's not that many other factors that could contribute to long-term strength increases. However, it's worth noting that in the short term, there are many other things that can play a role in improving your strength without necessarily growing muscle. Secondly, he makes the case that lengthened partials, you can't really track performance. I don't think that's true. I think that's a relatively big straw man. You can definitely track performance on lengthened partials. We've done some reliability testing to see whether or not people's performance is reliable when using lengthened partials, and it does seem to be reasonably reliable. Importantly, if you are going to be doing lengthened partials, just make an effort to standardize range of motion week upon week. But in my experience, having done lengthened partials a lot over the past 2 to 3 years, having used them with clients a lot for a few years now, you can definitely standardize range of motion to a very good extent. And performance tends to be very consistent week upon week. So I really don't think that's a big limitation of lengthened partials. Standardization is not that difficult. If you're doing machine whack, there's often a feature of the machine you can use to standardize range of motion very easily week upon week. If you're doing leg or arm whack, oftentimes you can end range of motion at around a 90-degree angle for a lot of movements. The same goes for most compound pressing movements. For RDLs and for rows, for example, you can literally just go until just past your knees. For pull-downs or pull-ups, you can just pull until the bar reaches your forehead, roughly. There's a lot of features you can use to standardize range of motion. And in my experience, I really don't think it's an issue. And importantly, just as far as stimulus goes, whether or not your range of motion is perfectly standardized week to week probably doesn't matter. If it takes pretty big differences in range of motion in these studies, in controlled environments, to be able to detect a difference in hypertrophy, then in practice, if your range of motion is off by 3 degrees from week to week, it's probably not going to influence hypertrophy very much.
So, for these exercises, research found that at least in untrained individuals, doing lengthened partials, leg extensions and calf raises is better because you're still not overloading the lengthened position. Most leg extension machines, at the top position, they're by far the hardest. And in the bottom position, you're just not overloading the muscle. So you can forego the top part and you can use more weight, which is also the case, which both of these studies found, crucially important point, that they could lift more weight with the partials for the same number of repetitions. Therefore, you get a higher overload of the stretch position when you're only doing the bottom part. So only doing this part instead of the whole movement. You're doing the bottom part with more weight, you're overloading the bottom part more. So for these exercises that don't stimulate the muscle while in a lengthened position, it might actually be better to do lengthened partials. A compromise that is often practical is to do lengthened partials for all sets other than the first set, or just do them for the last set, depending on if it's safe and the exercise lends itself well to lengthened partials. You also have to think of practical limitations here, of course. Now, stretch-mediated hypertrophy isn't the end-all be-all. It's very important, it can stimulate significantly more muscle growth, and traditionally programs have very much lacked emphasis on stretch-mediated hypertrophy. It is truly a revolution of the last years of exercise science. However, we also have studies showing that active tension is probably just as important. For example, we actually did a study ourselves where hip thrusts and squats turned out to be equally effective for the glutes. Now, hip thrusts shine for active tension, but they don't stimulate a lot of stretch-mediated hypertrophy probably. They don't put a lot of tension at long lengths because they don't even lengthen the glutes that much. Squats are much better at lengthening the glutes and therefore probably stimulate more stretch-mediated hypertrophy. We have research showing that the glutes grow more at longer versus shorter lengths, just like most other muscles. In fact, all tested muscles. So why then are hip thrusts equally effective? Well, it's likely because they generate more active tension. The glutes are strongest, probably. Actually, for the glutes, it's not completely clear, but based on the research we have, the glutes are strongest in anatomical position, which means that they can produce the most active force there, which is the top position of hip thrust. So the sticking point corresponds with the point where the muscle can produce the most force, which is great. You get a match between the resistance curve and your strength curve, essentially. And therefore, it seems that active mechanical tension can compensate for lack of stretch-mediated hypertrophy.
All right, a few things here. The study he's referring to is a study by Plotkin and colleagues where they compared squats to hip thrusts. So one group doing just squats to one group doing just hip thrusts, and measured hypertrophy of the gluteus, of the hamstrings, of the adductors, and of the quadriceps. And in that study, they found similar glute hypertrophy in the hip thrust versus the squat group. Importantly though, squats and hip thrusts are not the same exercise. There's a few differentiating factors. Another important confounder within this study, if you actually scroll through the supplementary materials, is that the depth achieved by many of the participants was substantially above parallel. So when you're talking about is a squat better than a hip thrust, you also have to factor range of motion into it to an extent. If I squat, for example, I can get quite a bit deeper than pretty much everyone in the study. So the way the squat was executed within the study likely impacted the results to a meaningful extent. Importantly, he brings up the glute's ability to produce tension as a moderating factor in how much hypertrophy they observed. Because the glutes are able to produce more force at the peak squeeze like you would do in a hip thrust, they then saw more growth, is the rationale being claimed. There's two things to note on that. Number one is that we don't really have direct evidence for this being a thing consistently. Neuromechanical matching, as it's been claimed around social media, doesn't really have much evidence in support of it. And additionally, there is direct evidence to the contrary. For instance, a study by Milo and colleagues, the same research group responsible for the research on the overhead extension versus the pushdown he cited, and the leg curl study that he cited, they also performed a study in the multi-hip hip extension exercise. If the idea that Menno was citing here was correct, that is to say that the glutes should grow more when being trained in more of a shortened position, because they are able to produce more tension in that position, then we should observe more glute hypertrophy in this study from the group that was training at shorter muscle lengths for the glutes. Instead, we observe the opposite, where the group doing lengthened partials training at longer muscle lengths, supposedly in a position where the glutes aren't able to produce as much active tension, saw around twice as much growth as the group training in a more shortened position. Similarly, another study by Kubo and colleagues found more hypertrophy when doing deeper squats to 140 degrees of knee flexion than a group squatting to only 90 degrees of knee flexion. And so, yet again, training at lower muscle lengths, where the glutes are supposedly able to produce less active tension, led to more hypertrophy. And so to me, this hypothesis is relatively weak for the time being.
The growth was the same when the total torque was equated, which meant that basically the seated lateral group, or more lengthened seated lateral group in this case, was not producing as much active force, therefore suggesting that active and passive tension are both equally important for muscle growth. Now, the exact mechanisms of stretch-mediated hypertrophy have not been fully elucidated, but I think this is currently the best working theory that corresponds well with all the exercise comparisons that we have. We also know that there's probably a limit to how much stretch-mediated hypertrophy really helps. Like, it doesn't help to stretch the muscle beyond a certain point, probably. We have, for example, a study showing that preacher curls, so when you have the elbow a little bit forward on a preacher curl bench, they do put a lot of tension when the muscle is relatively lengthened in the bottom position, but the muscle is not fully lengthened. And they compare that with incline double curls, which is when you're sitting and you're leaning back on a bench and your elbow is all the way back, so the biceps gets a great stretch. But in the bottom position, because you're using a dumbbell, gravity pulls straight down, there's actually no tension on the biceps. And they showed that the preacher curls seem to be slightly more effective for biceps growth, illustrating that, for one, the biceps gets the most active tension in the bottom position, but also there's probably a limit to just lengthening the muscle, how much that really helps. You, for one, need tension. You don't need to just lengthen the muscle, but you also need to lengthen it under high tension. And even then, there's probably a limit, because we have another study that compared preacher curls with a barbell, which really hammer the bottom position, versus a cable, which is more of an equal resistance curve throughout the entire range of motion. They were equally effective for muscle growth.
There's a few things to note here. The second study cited by Nunes and colleagues found around 10% more hypertrophy with the barbell versus the cable. So if anything, that's in line with the sort of effect size we typically observe when talking about lengthened training versus shortened training being more beneficial for muscle growth. Secondly, the other study cited by Zabaleta, Corey, and colleagues compared the incline curl to the preacher curl, observing more favorable hypertrophy of the biceps with the preacher curl compared to the incline curl. And indeed, I agree with him that this study provides support for the idea that you don't just want to stretch a muscle, you want to have it be performed under tension. And the preacher curl provides more tension in the bottom position compared to an incline curl. However, that is also evidence against the idea that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is what's occurring, as the stretch was much lower in the case of the preacher curl compared to the incline curl. If it was truly stretch-mediated hypertrophy underlying the benefits of lengthened partials and lengthened training, you would observe more hypertrophy from incline curls, and that wasn't the case. So clearly it's not simply being at a longer muscle length. And you can't just make the causal jump from animal studies on stretching or even human studies on stretching to lengthened partials and assume the same mechanism is at play.
You don't always have to go all in on stretch-mediated hypertrophy. It's also important to get high active tension, and even if there is stretch-mediated hypertrophy at play, there's probably a limit to how much it will grow and how much further emphasizing the stretch position and resistance in long muscle lengths, how much that will further benefit muscle growth.
I agree that there is probably a limit. The issue is we don't fully know yet because we haven't done those studies on anywhere near those limits of like maximum muscle length training with maximum tension. It's something that we still need to uncover. That is the video. I just reacted to Menno Henselmans' takes on stretch-mediated hypertrophy and how much it influences hypertrophy, whether it's even what is occurring behind lengthened partials, whether you should be training with a full range of motion or lengthened partials, and so on. My take, lengthened partials or even a full range of motion likely don't really stimulate meaningful amounts of stretch-mediated hypertrophy. I think it's a common misconception within the evidence-based fitness space at the moment. However, that doesn't mean that lengthened training isn't still better for hypertrophy. It's just not stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And my advice, if you want to maximize muscle growth, you should be focusing on the lengthened position. That could be through lengthened partials, it could maybe even be through exercise selection. Personally, all of my training is lengthened partials. Take that for what you will. I would give Menno like a 7 or 8 out of 10 here. I think his description of studies was spot on, like he was solid. But I think he is jumping to conclusions when it comes to stretch-mediated hypertrophy, some of the mechanisms at play, and potentially that is impacting his recommendations. But it is all love, and I've got much respect for Mr. Menno Henselmans. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment, subscribe. If there's anyone else you'd like to see me react to from an exercise scientist perspective, let me know down below. If you'd like me to coach you, check out the link above and we can make that happen. Alternatively, if you're looking at me right now and you're thinking, dude, I see your expensive luxury grandpa sweater, there's no way I can afford you. If that's the case, check out myo.com. We've got a training app being released within the next few months that is essentially going to be a coach in your pocket at a much lower price point. It'll write you an individualized program for muscle building based on your goals, your lifestyle, your circumstances, even whether or not you want to bring up certain muscle groups. So check out myo.com, sign up to be notified when it gets released, and you'll be able to lock in at a lower price than any other time. I hope you enjoyed this reaction video. Have a phenomenal day, and we'll see you next time. Peace.